I'm uncomfortable until we can understand System 1 better. I'm uncomfortable with attempts to automate things because what you're actually doing is you're designing products and goods, services and experiences for Homo economicus. You're designing it for this species of person that's never actually existed. Now, if you look at physical design, my car has a steering wheel, I imagine yours does too, okay, and the reason it does is because we happen to have evolved hands. Now, we didn't evolve hands to steer cars, we just designed physical objects, steering wheels, door handles, light switches, taps, to work with the physical equipment we happen to have as a product of evolution. Our hands were there to grasp branches or whatever, okay? Now, when we design psychological experiences, when we design for psychology, we don't use the same evolutionary approach. We don't say, well, you know, what's the ideal equipment, mental equipment, that might actually be used to operate this thing? How do we respect that in the way that a steering wheel does? Nobody ever says, you know, the steering wheel is exploiting your hands, because your hands
or I should be charging the company for the use of my hands. No.
So the interesting question is, you know, I think when we design mental things, when we design for the neck up, I don't think we're nearly so good at understanding. The Japanese have weird design philosophies, like the fact that cars should appear to smile, you know, which is patently a kind of understanding of System 1 instincts, that just, you know, we will like a car more if it's got a smiley face. But broadly speaking, we're not as good at that. I mean, unidentified object in the bagging area is, I mean, it's only one step up from Hal open the pod bay doors. I mean, it really is kind of like weird shit. And that, I think, is really, really important. I mean, I have a hunch that actually, for System 1, the hive system of control is better than the nest system of, you know, sometimes senseless anticipation. Because, you know, there are various factors, like the fact that your wife's German or something, which the nest system will never really be able to get its head round. I mean, there's a wonderful case, of course, which happens, which is people have bought illegal nests outside the UK and US, and they don't understand the time zone. So Nest is, meanwhile, going completely bonkers. My friend was thinking of buying it in Thailand, looked for other people's experiences, and said, Nest will go completely bonkers because it'll suddenly conclude that you're nocturnal. And there's a wonderful case, actually, which happened in Ogilvy, which is we founded a thing called Ogilvy Pride for the LGBT members who work at Ogilvy in both offices, you see. And the announcement of this was sent out by BCC. And one colleague of mine who is gay wrote to the person who sent it, said, look, you can't do that. She said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, anybody who's gay but not out, who just receives this thing addressed purely to them, with no BCC me, with no idea it's been sent to the whole office, will suddenly have it. You see, I must admit, that wouldn't have occurred to me, you see. But someone who was gay and out gay immediately spotted what was the interpretation you'd put on that communication if you were, you know, not out, which is, again, I mean, wonderful cases where these algorithms go hopelessly wrong because they don't allow for context. Now, if you want a really good Internet of Things conversation, actually, the Google driverless car is a really interesting question, because my question is, if the driverless car works really well 99% of the time, but rather like autopilots and aircraft, when the pitot tube freezes over, it spasms and goes, does not compute, over to you. Because humans are much better at dealing with unexpected surprise circumstances, for the most part, than machines are, okay? Now, if the driverless car, if I've got to sit there, basically, at a wheel for the whole journey because of the possibility that 1 minute every hour the computerized thing is going to spasm, it's actually worse than just driving the car myself. So good, do you see what I mean? That when we mathematicize things, we automatically end up designing a world for System 2. And most human happiness, well-being, contentment is really generated, or feelings of trust, or feelings of, you know, loyalty. That's all generated in System 1. So rationality is a very, very bad tool. There's an interesting thing called Moravec's paradox, which comes from artificial intelligence, which is the idea that the things that computers are good at, humans aren't very good at. Okay, you know, basically, from a computer's point of view, Garry Kasparov isn't that clever because a computer can beat him at chess. But David Beckham's a bloody genius, because in terms of sensory motor skills, the things that are a product of evolution, those problems, the things that a 5-year-old child can do, a computer, like picking up a pencil or walking into a room, a computer finds almost unbelievably difficult. So, interestingly, getting a computer to beat Garry Kasparov at chess is difficult but possible. Getting a computer to beat David Beckham at football is a real challenge. In fact, you probably couldn't even beat Garry Kasparov at football. Or me, okay? Now, the interesting thing with the driverless car is there's a lot of intelligence about context, okay, which we instinctively understand, social intelligence as well. Now, the septics don't have roundabouts. How good will driverless cars be on roundabouts, where understanding, reading the intentionality of other motorists, even by the direction in which their wheels are pointed, okay, or by their road position, is a really crucial social skill. You know, in traffic jams, you know, I tend to leave a bit of a gap for anybody who needs to change lane. Will driverless cars actually instinctively have the social intelligence and sort of mirror neurons that are required to do that kind of thing?
Or until they do, what's going to happen?
And likewise, in that kind of ghastly intervening stage, you know, what actually happens? And you might say, well, actually, driverless cars, when every car's a driverless car, isn't that big a problem? But ultimately, all technology has to interface with people in some respect, or otherwise, what the hell is it for? So the potential catastrophe thing we need to actually look at, because when you connect devices that are logical, the effects when you put them all together can actually be absurd. You know, we have to ask an interesting question, which is, you know, at a very simple level, my heating now will automatically come on if the house goes below 5 degrees. I've got Hive. Now, that's probably fine, but it does raise an interesting question. If you automate other things where they all have a trigger point, do you suddenly get a surge of demand in a way that you wouldn't get with human agency? Now, I think in that case, I think it's fine. But if you have a strange thing where, you know, and there's a wonderful thing that happened, by the way, when they introduced autopilots for landing, and the sort of automated landing system with planes, which is they suddenly realized after a short while they had to build a degree of randomness into it, because the same 2 feet of tarmac were getting battered to bastardy because every single plane was landing on exactly the same point, which didn't happen with human pilots.
Talking about Nest versus Hive, which is very interesting. Nest as a learning algorithm, and Hive as a responsive algorithm, I suppose. Yeah. And arguably, Nest is perhaps is the slightly cleverer, you know, the precocious child, whereas Hive is the sort of useful plodder. And which one could you tolerate in your life longer?
Well, in a sense, you see, I think if you take that idea that, you know, media are extensions of the self in some way, I think at some level we prefer to have some degree of specific autonomy. And first of all, I'm not sure you can predict human whim. I'm not sure you can build an algorithm which understands it all that well.
I think it's, I think you can, this is where the dreaded big data comes in, of course. You can say that there's an 80% chance of X happening based on the data you have, but all you're ever doing is putting a hypothesis against the likelihood.
Yeah.
And I think,
and also bear in mind that the data you have available is not the complete story. So a very simple fact you might say about Nest. Funnily enough, I was talking to one of the Hive development team, whose wife is German. Now, I don't know if you know this, very strong German cultural thing. You have your room, your bedroom in particular, is kept very cold overnight. Yeah. And they'll even open their windows routinely in the winter.
Yes, and I prefer that myself, actually. Yeah.
Funny enough, I do as well. But I mean, it's a bit like the French thing with drafts, where all French children are brought up to believe that you effectively die if you sit in a draft. And Germans think it's somehow either sort of immoral or may lead to, you know, lascivious thoughts if you have an overheated bedroom. And Hive, the interesting question is, the attempt to formulate truth from a limited number of data points is always a bit dangerous, because
that is the central issue with Internet of Things.
You get what you might say is the confounding variable here is that Germans just like colder bedrooms. Now, what does Hive actually do in this case? Nest. What does Nest do? Does it then make all American bedrooms a little bit colder to reflect, you know, an aggregate international preference, shall we say? Because it may not have the information which is, this is just a German thing. I have to confess to this Internet of Things guilty confession, which is sitting on the tarmac at Sydney Airport. I actually turned my central heating on for 5 minutes just because you could, on the why do dogs lick their own balls principle, because they can. And it was just the feeling that you could be on the other side of the world, make a little boiler come on, and then go off again.
I think there'll be a phrase though. We'll call it thing wank.
Yes, yeah, absolutely right. So the Internet of Things will go through the thing wank phase, which, I mean, I must admit, when I signed up for If This Then That, I went through a thing wank phase, which is, whoa, I can actually link my lights to the hourly recorded weather forecast from Sandetti Light Vessel Automatic.